Welcome back to the deep dive. Before we get into today's material, I just have a quick request for you.
Mhm.
If you appreciate the work we do here, digging up the topics that the mainstream media usually leaves in the dark, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us keep the lights on and allows us to keep bringing you these deep dives.
Yeah, it makes a huge
It
difference.
really does. Now, today we are looking at a text that is, well, let's say unapologetic. We're covering an ultra-long, incisive, and definitely controversial new ebook titled Exceptional British Isles Spreading Great Ideas, and that's by Conrad Riker.
Right, and unapologetic is honestly putting it mildly. Riker has written what is essentially a full-throated defense of the British Empire and Western civilization, but he's doing it through a very specific lens. He argues that the institutions we rely on today were built specifically by male aggression, hierarchy, and risk-taking.
And he claims we are currently watching those same institutions dismantle because we've, in his words, ignored biological reality.
Yeah.
So to set the stage here, we need to be clear that Riker isn't exactly writing this for a general consensus audience. He is writing specifically for men who feel like the modern cultural narrative has gone completely off the rails.
Right.
If you are a guy listening to this who is tired of hearing that masculinity is toxic or that your natural drive is somehow a problem that needs to be managed, Riker is speaking directly to you. He frames this book as a red-pilled look at history.
Yeah, an analysis of how the world actually worked before, as he argues, our core institutions were captured by modern feminist and Marxist ideologies.
And the mission of the book is really to reclaim that narrative, isn't
And
it?
that's the stated goal.
Hmm.
And to do that, Riker draws on a massive stack of source material. We're talking historical naval logs, military deployment data, evolutionary psychology, economic statistics. He uses all of this to argue that a safe, egalitarian civilization is not a natural state. It's a highly artificial construct.
A construct built by a specific type of energy.
Right. His core thesis is that everything functioning around us was constructed by the biological reality of male drive and dominance.
It's a heavy thesis for sure, and we're going to pull apart the sources to see how he structures these arguments. But if that pitch already intrigues you, I'd urge you right now to check out the source material directly. You can buy a copy of Exceptional British Isles, Spreading Great Ideas on Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks.
Highly recommend looking at the raw data he presents.
Yeah, and if you want to follow the author's uncensored thoughts as he writes them, you can find him at Conrad Riker on Substack. All right, let's get into the mechanics of this. Riker starts the book with a section called The Engine of Progress. What is the actual mechanism he's describing here when he talks about innovation?
So he begins by taking aim at the modern idea of collaborative science. He completely challenges the committee approach and defends a brutal version of the great man theory. Yeah, Riker argues that true innovation, the kind that actually shifts paradigms and moves humanity forward, is biologically expensive. It requires a state of obsessive, singular focus that is just fundamentally incompatible with social consensus.
That he's saying the solo genius isn't just a romantic trope.
No, he says it's a metabolic necessity for a breakthrough.
And he uses James Watt and Isaac Newton as his primary case studies for this. But he's not just saying, oh, they were really smart guys, right?
Right, it's about the environment they operated in and their neurochemistry. Take James Watt. Riker paints this vivid picture of Watt in the 1770s, and he's not in a comfortable university lounge. He's in a grimy workshop obsessing over steam condensers day and night.
Sweating over metal.
Exactly. And the argument in the book is that if Watt had been subject to a modern committee or a focus group or had to worry about work-life balance, the steam engine would have failed.
Because collaboration dilutes the focus.
That's his claim. The flow state required to solve a physics problem of that magnitude requires total isolation. Riker argues that social interaction, specifically the modern need for consensus and safety, breaks that specific neurochemical state.
He goes even further with Newton, doesn't he?
He uses Newton as the ultimate proof of this concept. Newton discovered gravity and formulated the laws of motion while he was completely isolated during the Great Plague. Riker emphasizes that this was male logic operating in an absolute vacuum.
No safe spaces.
No inclusive language guides, no HR department, just one man dismantling medieval superstition with raw mathematics.
And the source material brings some pretty stark numbers to back up this idea of male-driven innovation. He calls it the patent gap.
Yeah, he cites data from global patent records between 1700 and 1900 The data shows that 97% of major inventions during that industrial explosion came from men.
Now, obviously, modern critics would immediately say, well, that's just because women were systematically excluded from education and patent offices at the time.
Of course. And Riker addresses that directly by flipping the premise. He argues the gap isn't about social exclusion, it's about risk tolerance.
Risk tolerance.
Right. He draws a direct evolutionary line from those Victorian inventors to modern male founders like Elon Musk or the Wright brothers. His point is that men are biologically wired by testosterone to bet the farm. They will risk their reputation, their resources, even their physical safety on a single, possibly crazy idea.
Because the biological reward for status is so high.
Exactly. Whereas the modern corporate approach is entirely about risk mitigation.
Which brings us to modern diverse boards.
Right. Riker argues that modern boards prioritize safety and consensus above all else. They are designed by committee to prevent failure. But he claims that by preventing failure, you inadvertently prevent the kind of high-risk, high-reward breakthroughs that built the modern world in the first place.
We've traded the volatility of genius for the stagnation of safety.
That is the exact framing he uses.
This bleeds right into the social aspect, too. He introduces this concept called the toxic paradox. And I think this is something a lot of men listening might intimately relate to. We hear constantly in the media that men need to be vulnerable, that it's okay to cry, that stoicism is toxic. But Riker says this is a trap.
He calls it the double bind. He argues that while society says it wants vulnerable men, it biologically and socially selects against them.
How does he prove that?
He points to modern dating app data. He cites swiping statistics showing that women overwhelmingly reject men who appear vulnerable or sad or soft in their profile photos.
They swipe left on the crying men.
Overwhelmingly. And instead, they favor men who signal dominance, resource control, and decisiveness. So the cultural narrative says open up, but the biological reality of the dating market says toughen up.
He uses a really grounded example for this, too. The story of the Detroit auto worker or the modern firefighter.
Yeah, these men are called heroes and praised for their stoicism when it benefits society. You know, running into a burning building or working a brutal double shift to keep the grid running.
But if they bring that same stoic, hardened mindset home,
then they're suddenly labeled emotionally absent or toxic. Riker argues society demands a man be a rock for protection, but then punishes him for being hard when the crisis is over. You literally see men in his examples who open up to their partners, only to report that their partner lost respect for them shortly after.
It's a brutal assessment. Let's move from the individual mind to the physical world, which is segment 2 of his book, Building the World. Riker argues that the Industrial Revolution wasn't just about inventing machines, it was about forging a completely new type of human discipline.
He calls this mechanical virility. It's a fascinating, albeit ruthless, historical concept. He compares the economic output of Lancashire's all-male textile mills to the communal village-style weaving found in places like Tahiti at the exact same time.
And the Lancashire mills were notoriously harsh.
Brutal, high-stress, dangerous environments. But Riker argues that the strict hierarchies and what he calls the cruel logic of the time clock were mathematically necessary to maximize output.
It almost sounds like he's defending the Dickensian conditions of the early factories.
He is contextualizing them as an evolutionary step. He argues that things like Josiah Wedgwood's strict pottery factory rules or even early industrial discipline weren't about malice or oppression just for the fun of it.
They were about imposing order on chaos.
Exactly. To create mass abundance, you needed mechanical virility. He actually makes the controversial claim that introducing modern empathy into that specific developmental phase would have halted the industrial progress that eventually lifted the entire globe out of absolute poverty.
He applies this exact same logic to infrastructure. The story of Joseph Bazalgette and the London sewers is prominent here.
This is his prime example of engineering over empathy. In the mid-19th century, London was literally dying of cholera. The Thames was an open sewer. People were suffering immensely.
And Riker's point is that you don't solve cholera with compassion.
Right. Bazalgette didn't solve the Great Stink by holding listening sessions or validating the citizens' feelings. He solved it by sheer aggressive force of will. He tore up the city, dug thousands of miles of tunnels, and imposed a massive sanitation system on a chaotic environment.
He saved lives through dominance over nature.
Engineering, not empathy.
And then there's the British Empire itself.
Mm-hmm.
Riker does not apologize for the colonial era at all.
Not even slightly. He frames the British Empire strictly as a massive project of technological distribution.
Connecting the world.
Yes. He points to the construction of the railways in India, the laying of global telegraph cables, the systematic use of quinine to conquer malaria in the tropics. He views these as essential tools of civilization that could only have been deployed by a culture that was willing to aggressively conquer.
The argument being that polite dialogue didn't connect the continents.
The Gatling gun and the steamship connected the continents. That's his stance.
That naturally brings us to the military chapter, which he titles Defiant Spirit. He has a section here on the SAS and the Falklands War that really highlights this male aggression he's talking about.
He focuses heavily on military audacity, the willingness of men to do the completely irrational thing because the tribal hierarchy and the mission demand it.
Give us the David Sterling example.
So during World War II in North Africa, David Sterling and the early SAS would literally drive open-top jeeps straight onto heavily guarded enemy airfields, machine gunning planes, and then just speed back out into the deep desert.
It was basically a suicide mission on paper.
Exactly. It's high-risk, high-reward behavior that Riker says is exclusively fueled by male bonding and testosterone.
He also mentions the Yomp across the Falklands.
Right. British forces marching across freezing bogs with massive amounts of gear. He argues they endure those extreme conditions entirely due to male physical endurance and the shame-based hierarchy of all male units.
But he contrasts this historical success directly with the modern military. And this is where he brings in some very specific modern data regarding mixed gender units.
Yes, and this is where the book challenges current Pentagon policy head-on. He cites the 2015 Marine Corps Force Integration Plan.
What did the data show?
The study's data showed that all male units were faster and outperformed mixed gender units in 69% of evaluated tactical tasks. But the statistic Riker really leans heavily on is the injury rate.
Right, the physical toll.
The study claimed that mixed units had injury rates that were more than twice as high as the all-male units, alongside lower overall unit cohesion and lethality.
So his argument is that by ignoring biological reality in the name of social equality, we are objectively making our military weaker.
Correct. He calls this concept predatory synchronicity. The idea is that men bond in a very specific evolutionary way under fire. It's a wiring for hunting and warfare. He argues that introducing mixed gender dynamics completely disrupts that fragile unit cohesion, regardless of how well trained the individual soldiers might be.
Let's pivot from warfare to the institutions that keep society stable during peacetime: law and finance. Riker claims that English common law wasn't just a legal system, it was a commercial weapon.
He views common law as formalized adversarial scrutiny. It's a legal system built entirely on conflict. Logic against logic, man against man, fighting with words to find the objective truth.
So it's not about finding a compromise.
No, he contrasts this with consensus-based systems found in other cultures. He argues that the adversarial, combative nature of English law provided the rigid predictability required for global trade.
He points to places like Hong Kong and Singapore for this.
Yeah, these are places that adopted this British legal DNA and exploded into economic powerhouses. Because the law protected property and enforced contracts with ruthless efficiency rather than worrying about fairness.
And he ties this legal ruthlessness into what he calls the Protestant ethic in banking.
It's the historical combination of high testosterone risk-taking and severe moral discipline. He traces the lineage of modern finance from harsh figures like John Knox all the way to the Quaker bankers.
The link being that economic growth requires a certain type of man.
His theory is that the velocity of money, which is how fast capital moves to where it's needed to build things, depends entirely on decisive, highly risk-tolerant leadership.
But he argues we're currently losing that velocity. Why is that?
He calls this chapter the capture of institutions. He argues that the recent introduction of ESG, that's environmental, social, and governance scores, along with strict diversity quotas in banking, is totally gumming up the works.
He makes a specific comparison to the 2008 financial crash.
He does. He compares the post-crash recovery of banks that retain traditional male-dominated leadership to those that aggressively diversify their boards. He cites data suggesting that diverse boards were significantly slower to make the painful, ruthless cuts necessary to survive and grow.
He calls this the vulnerability trap applied to economics.
Essentially, yes. We're prioritizing feeling good and being inclusive over doing well and generating capital. He believes modern finance is becoming risk-averse and heavily bureaucratic because it's no longer run by the hunter archetype.
And that ties into how the media functions too. He talks about the British use of the telegraph and Reuters as an information weapon.
Power through objective, fast information.
Right, and he contrasts that with modern media, which he says is entirely feelings-based, which leads to what he calls the Atlas penalty. Society praises men for carrying the heavy burden of civilization, but the media and culture punish them the second they admit the burden is heavy or ask for things to be done their way.
That's the trap.
Now, we need to get into segment 4, the modern crisis. This is probably the most explosive part of the source material. Riker tackles gender realism and the idea that state-mandated equality is actually destabilizing society. He looks closely at Sweden.
Yes, the Sweden paradox. Sweden is often held up globally as the ultimate poster child for gender equality, but Riker cites long-term studies suggesting that as state-mandated equality increased in Sweden, so did divorce rates, and so did reported anxiety levels in children.
How does he explain that correlation?
His argument relies on biology. He states that humans are a sexually dimorphic species. We are biologically specialized. When the state forces men and women to act as identical, interchangeable economic units, it creates massive psychological friction.
So traditional roles aren't oppressive, they're optimal.
In his view, yes. He argues that traditional roles where men provide and women nurture create a reliable social scaffolding, and that predictability lowers baseline anxiety for everyone in the family.
He also goes straight after the concept of the glass ceiling. He says it's not institutional oppression keeping women out of boardrooms, it's biology.
He reframes the entire concept as the motherhood preference. He argues that the lack of women in top-tier 80-hour-a-week CEO roles isn't due to systemic discrimination.
It's driven by oxytocin.
Exactly. A biological drive fueled by oxytocin that naturally prioritizes family, bonding, and personal well-being.
While men are driven by testosterone.
Right, to aggressively seek status and hoard resources, often at the complete expense of their own health and happiness. He says modern feminism is pathologizing women's perfectly healthy biological choices by labeling them as oppression.
And then there's the family court system. For the men listening who have been through a rough divorce, this section of the book might hit particularly hard. Riker outright calls the courts gynocentric.
He argues the legal system has swung violently from protecting the family unit as a whole to exclusively protecting the mother, almost always at the financial and emotional expense of the father.
He brings up some pretty harsh examples from court records.
He cites specific legal cases where primary custody is awarded to mothers despite documented evidence of severe drug abuse or neglect, simply due to an overwhelming maternal bias in the system. He argues this modern system is practically designed to strip fathers of their assets and their authority.
And the societal consequence of that is mass fatherlessness.
The statistics he cites here are undeniable, and Riker really hammers them home. He connects fatherless homes directly to higher childhood poverty rates, higher adolescent drug use, and significantly higher incarceration rates for young boys.
Because the discipline is gone.
He argues that by legally and culturally removing the father, who represents the archetype of authority and boundaries, society is mass-producing a generation of lost men.
He also touches on what happens to physical infrastructure when merit is replaced by diversity in technical fields.
He refers to this as the competence crisis.
Right.
He points to recent, highly publicized infrastructure failures, things like bridge collapses, severe aerospace manufacturing defects, and he correlates them with the corporate decline in strict meritocratic hiring.
So when institutions become feminized, the physical world suffers.
That is his claim. He argues that when an engineering firm hires for identity metrics rather than pure mechanical virility or absolute competence, the physical scaffolding of the world starts to degrade. As he puts it, gravity doesn't care about your diversity statement, it only cares about physics.
It's a very sobering look at where we might be heading. Riker ends the book with a section he literally calls a final warning. What is the ultimatum he's giving the reader here?
His conclusion, titled Unapologetic Legacy, warns that civilization is incredibly fragile. It's not a permanent, naturally occurring state. He uses the metaphor that civilization is a garden that constantly requires a heavily armed wall.
And men have to man the wall.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He argues that if men check out of the system, and he points to the herbivore men in Japan as a real-time example of this.
These are the young men who have just completely stopped dating, stopped buying cars, stopped striving for promotions.
Yes. If men lose the incentive to build and protect, the civilization slowly collapses. Economically, because the aggressive drive to innovate vanishes, and demographically, because birth rates inevitably crash.
So he's putting the burden of survival squarely back on men's shoulders.
He is. He's asking the reader to make a very stark choice. Are you a builder or are you a bystander? He's telling men to utterly reject the toxic label, to stop apologizing for their biological nature, and to embrace the historical role of the architect and the protector.
Because without that energy, everything stops.
He believes that without that specific, uncompromising male energy, the lights of Western civilization literally go out.
That is definitely a lot to chew on for you listening at home. Riker's essentially offering a complete inversion of the mainstream narrative we are fed daily. He's saying that the very traits we are told are societal problems, things like aggression, strict hierarchy, unapologetic stoicism, are actually the critical load-bearing walls of our entire society.
It's certainly a perspective that forces you to ruthlessly examine your baseline assumptions. Riker demands that you look at the comfort of the modern world and ask yourself if we can really afford to villainize the engine that built it.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. If everything Riker says is true, and the institutions are already captured, what does a red-pilled man actually do tomorrow morning to start reclaiming his own scaffolding? It's something to explore on your own. But look, if this conversation sparked something in you, if you want to arm yourself with the raw data, the naval logs, the history, and the arguments we've barely scratched the surface of today, you really need to read this book. It's exceptional British Isles Spreading Great Ideas by Conrad Riker. You can grab the ebook right now. Go check Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books.
It's a dense, challenging read, but for the audience Riker is targeting, it's likely an essential one.
Absolutely. And don't forget to follow the author directly at Conrad Riker on Substack for his daily, uncensored takes on this stuff. And finally, if you value what we do here, if you want us to keep bringing you these deep dives into the controversial books that the establishment tries to ignore, please hit like and subscribe to the channel right now. It makes a huge difference for us. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.